Right now, ancient Greece gets popularly remembered primarily for its towering philosophical achievements, its foundational contributions to democracy, and its lasting influence on Western art and architecture. What frequently gets left out of that more celebratory popular narrative is a considerably darker, more difficult reality that existed alongside all of that genuine intellectual achievement: the institution of sexual slavery, a practice deeply embedded within ancient Greek society that involved genuine, sustained human suffering on a significant scale. Understanding this history honestly matters, not to sensationalize it, but because confronting the full, complicated reality of any historical society, rather than only its most flattering, celebrated achievements, is essential for actually understanding how that society really functioned and who bore the real human cost of its more celebrated accomplishments. Let's dig into this properly, treating this difficult subject with the historical seriousness it deserves, focused specifically on what documented historical evidence actually reveals about the structure of this institution and the genuine, well-documented suffering it inflicted on the people trapped within it. Let's start with the basic legal and social framework within which this institution operated, because understanding this structure is essential for properly grasping the genuine severity of what these individuals actually experienced. Ancient Greek society, like many ancient societies, maintained an extensive system of slavery more broadly, with enslaved individuals possessing essentially no legal rights or personal autonomy, and existing as legal property under the complete control of their owner. Within this broader system of slavery, certain enslaved individuals, both women and in some documented contexts, boys and young men, were specifically held and exploited for sexual purposes, frequently within a recognized, socially normalized institution rather than existing as some kind of hidden, marginal practice outside ordinary Greek social life. This detail is seriously important to establish clearly up front because it reveals something crucial about the actual severity of this institution. In many specific contexts, it functioned as a legally sanctioned, socially accepted institution, rather than some kind of forbidden, unusual criminal practice existing at the margins of ancient Greek society, meaning the individuals trapped within it had essentially no legal recourse, no recognized social protection, and no meaningful path toward escaping their situation, since the entire surrounding legal and social structure actively supported and normalized their continued exploitation rather than offering any kind of protective counterbalance. Let's talk about how individuals actually ended up in this specific situation, because understanding this pathway helps illustrate the complete absence of any meaningful personal choice or consent involved in this institution. Individuals became enslaved for sexual exploitation through several documented pathways, including being captured during warfare, a devastatingly common practice throughout the ancient Mediterranean world where defeated populations, women and children specifically, frequently faced enslavement as a direct, expected consequence of military defeat. Others were sold into slavery due to extreme poverty, sometimes by their own desperate families facing circumstances offering no other viable alternative for survival. While still others were born directly into slavery, inheriting their enslaved status automatically from an already enslaved parent with absolutely no choice or personal agency involved in that circumstance whatsoever. This detail is worth sitting with directly because it eliminates any possible ambiguity regarding consent or personal choice within this institution. These were not individuals who had selected this circumstance for themselves in any meaningful sense. They were people stripped of their basic legal personhood through warfare, poverty, or the mere circumstance of their birth, then subjected to ongoing sexual exploitation as enslaved property with no legal standing to refuse, resist, or seek any kind of meaningful protection or recourse. Let's talk about the specific institution often referred to using a particular Greek term, because understanding this specific, well-documented context helps illustrate exactly how this system actually operated in practice. Certain enslaved women were specifically trained and maintained within a role that combined sexual exploitation with expectations of providing companionship, conversation, and entertainment for wealthy Greek men. A role that some popular historical accounts have occasionally romanticized or softened considerably beyond what the actual historical evidence honestly supports. While these particular women sometimes received training in music, conversation, and other cultivated skills, and occasionally held a marginally different social position compared to other enslaved individuals. It's essential to state clearly and directly that this arrangement remained fundamentally rooted in slavery and coercion. These women remained legal property, lacking any genuine autonomy regarding their own bodies or life circumstances, and any historical account that romanticizes this specific role without directly acknowledging this fundamental underlying reality of ownership and coercion fails to honestly represent the actual documented historical circumstances these women truly faced. Let's talk about the complete absence of legal protection or recourse available to these individuals too, because this represents perhaps the single most important, defining feature of this institution worth understanding clearly. Enslaved individuals within ancient Greek society, including those specifically held for sexual exploitation, had no legal standing to bring any kind of formal complaint or seek protection against mistreatment from their owner. Their owner maintained complete, essentially unlimited legal authority over their body and circumstances, and ancient Greek law provided no meaningful mechanism through which an enslaved person could challenge or resist this treatment, regardless of how severe or sustained that mistreatment actually was. This complete absence of legal protection meant these individuals existed in a state of seriously total vulnerability, with their entire physical and psychological well-being depending entirely on the specific temperament and choices of whichever individual owner happened to hold legal control over them at any given time. Let's talk about the psychological and physical toll this institution inflicted too, because acknowledging this genuine, documented human suffering directly matters for properly understanding the full historical reality already being explored throughout this discussion. Historical and archaeological evidence, combined with careful scholarly analysis of surviving ancient texts referencing this institution, suggests these individuals faced sustained physical and psychological trauma, complete loss of personal autonomy and family connection, and the profound ongoing degradation inherent in having one's own body treated as another person's legal property available for their unrestricted sexual use. This genuine human suffering, experienced by real historical individuals whose own personal voices and direct testimony were rarely, if ever, actually preserved or recorded within the surviving historical record, deserves direct, honest acknowledgement rather than being minimized, softened, or treated as some kind of incidental historical footnote within broader discussions of ancient Greek cultural and intellectual achievement. Let's talk about the specific historical sources scholars actually rely on to study this institution, because understanding where this historical knowledge actually comes from matters for properly evaluating its reliability and its inherent limitations. Much of what historians know about ancient Greek sexual slavery comes from legal texts, various forms of surviving Greek literature, court speeches, and other administrative and cultural records, the overwhelming majority of which were written by free men, generally from relatively privileged social positions, rather than by the enslaved individuals themselves. This detail carries an important, sobering implication worth stating directly. The actual voices, direct testimony, and personal perspective of the people who were actually enslaved and sexually exploited within this system were rarely recorded or preserved in any direct, first-person form, meaning much of what modern historians can reconstruct about their actual lived experience must be carefully inferred from external sources written by the very people who held power over them, rather than drawn from these individuals' own direct, unmediated testimony. This particular limitation in the historical record is worth sitting with honestly, because it means the full depth of suffering experienced by these individuals likely exceeds what surviving historical sources directly document or even acknowledge, given that the people writing and preserving the historical record generally had little direct incentive to fully, honestly document the suffering of people they considered legal property rather than full human beings deserving of serious historical or literary attention in their own right. Let's talk about male sexual exploitation within this broader system too, because a complete, historically honest account of this topic requires acknowledging that enslaved boys and young men were also subjected to sexual exploitation within certain specific contexts of ancient Greek society, alongside the enslaved women already discussed extensively throughout this topic. Historical evidence indicates that enslaved young males were sometimes specifically acquired and exploited for sexual purposes as well. existing within the same broader legal framework of ownership and complete absence of personal autonomy already established throughout this discussion. This detail is worth including specifically because it demonstrates that this institution's fundamental cruelty, rooted in the total absence of consent and legal protection for enslaved individuals, extended across gender lines rather than representing a form of exploitation experienced exclusively by enslaved women alone. By the way, if you want to go even deeper into the secret lives of ancient humans, I just launched a full course called The Secret Lives of Ancient Humans. 10 modules, 3+ hours of content covering everything we never talk about on YouTube. What they feared, how they communicated, what hunted them, and much more. Plus an exclusive PDF guide included. Link in the description. See you inside. Let's talk about the complicated question of manumission, meaning the formal freeing of an enslaved individual, and how it applied, or often failed to meaningfully apply, within this specific context, too, because this represents an important, frequently misunderstood detail worth exploring directly. While ancient Greek slavery did include some documented pathways toward eventual manumission for certain enslaved individuals under certain specific circumstances, historians studying this topic emphasize that these pathways were neither guaranteed nor evenly available, and that an enslaved person's actual prospects for eventual freedom depended almost entirely on the specific will and decisions of their owner, rather than reflecting any kind of reliable, legally guaranteed process an enslaved individual could actively pursue or count on. For individuals specifically held for sexual exploitation, some historical evidence suggests manumission occasionally occurred, sometimes connected to a specific owner's personal attachment or changing circumstances. But this should not be misunderstood as evidence of any kind of general leniency or improved treatment within this institution more broadly. The rare inconsistent possibility of eventual manumission for a small number of individuals doesn't meaningfully offset the systematic, sustained lack of protection and autonomy experienced by the overwhelming majority of people trapped within this system throughout the actual duration of their enslavement. Let's talk about how this topic has been treated within popular culture and media across various more recent historical periods too, because this represents an important, directly relevant point worth addressing before continuing this discussion. Various works of popular fiction, film, and other media across different eras have periodically depicted ancient Greek sexual slavery in ways that scholars studying this history have specifically criticized for romanticizing or softening the coercive, non-consensual reality of the actual historical institution, sometimes presenting these relationships with a degree of implied mutual affection or agency that the actual historical evidence simply doesn't support, given everything already discussed throughout this topic regarding the complete legal and social powerlessness these individuals actually experienced. Responsible historical engagement with this topic requires actively resisting this kind of popular romanticization, insisting instead on centering the actual, well-documented reality of coercion, ownership, and absent consent that defined this institution as it actually existed historically. Let's talk about how scholars specifically distinguish between studying this history responsibly versus simply cataloging disturbing historical details for their own sake too, because this represents an important methodological and ethical consideration, worth addressing directly. Responsible historical scholarship on this topic generally focuses on understanding the broader social, legal, and economic structures that made this institution possible and sustained it over time, examining questions regarding how ancient Greek society's broader legal and economic systems, its structures of citizenship, property, and gender, worked together to create and maintain conditions allowing this kind of systematic exploitation to persist as a normalized feature of everyday social life. This structural analytical approach serves an important educational purpose, helping modern audiences understand exactly how ordinary legal and social systems, rather than simply extraordinary individual cruelty alone, can combine to sustain profound, systematic human suffering when a society's fundamental legal and social structures fail to recognize the full personhood and rights of a significant portion of its population. Let's talk about how ancient Greek intellectual and cultural figures themselves actually discussed and treated this institution too, because this represents an important, historically revealing detail worth exploring directly. Notably, this institution existed alongside, and was frequently discussed with considerable casualness by many of the same prominent ancient Greek intellectual figures still celebrated today for their philosophical and cultural contributions. This detail is worth including specifically because it illustrates an uncomfortable but historically important reality: genuine intellectual and cultural achievement, of the kind that continues to be celebrated many centuries later, coexisted directly alongside institutions responsible for profound, sustained human suffering, without most of that same celebrated society's intellectual tradition treating this coexistence as any kind of significant moral contradiction requiring serious ethical examination or challenge. Let's talk about how modern historians actually approach and study this difficult topic responsibly too, because this represents an important methodological consideration worth addressing directly. Responsible historians studying ancient slavery and sexual exploitation generally emphasize the importance of centering the actual documented experience and suffering of enslaved individuals themselves, to whatever extent the surviving historical evidence actually allows, rather than focusing primarily on the perspective or experience of slaveholders, or presenting ancient sexual slavery through an uncritical, romanticized lens that fails to honestly acknowledge the coercion and suffering fundamentally inherent to the institution. This scholarly approach requires careful, honest engagement with remarkably difficult, uncomfortable historical material, resisting any temptation to sanitize or minimize the actual human cost involved, simply because the broader historical period and society in question also produced other actually significant, celebrated cultural and intellectual achievements. Let's talk about how this ancient institution connects to broader patterns of historical sexual exploitation and slavery too, because this represents an important, sobering point of context worth including before wrapping up this discussion. Ancient Greek sexual slavery wasn't a uniquely isolated historical phenomenon confined only to this specific ancient society. Similar institutions of sexual exploitation connected to broader systems of slavery have appeared across numerous other historical societies and periods throughout world history, reflecting a persistent, deeply troubling pattern of human societies exploiting positions of extreme power imbalance for sexual purposes, a pattern that historians studying this broader topic generally emphasize requires honest, direct acknowledgement, specifically because confronting this uncomfortable historical pattern honestly represents an essential part of properly understanding human history and social organization more broadly. Let's talk about how this specific ancient Greek institution compares to sexual slavery documented across other ancient civilizations too, because this broader comparative context helps illustrate that this wasn't some unique aberration specific only to Greek society, but rather reflected patterns that appeared repeatedly across numerous ancient societies operating under broadly comparable legal and social structures regarding slavery, property, and gender more generally. Ancient Rome, various ancient Near Eastern civilizations, and numerous other ancient societies documented throughout world history maintained broadly similar institutions: sexual exploitation of enslaved individuals who possessed no legal standing to refuse or resist, suggesting this pattern emerged repeatedly wherever a society combined widespread slavery with legal systems that failed to recognize enslaved individuals as possessing basic personhood or bodily autonomy. This comparative pattern doesn't make the ancient Greek institution any less serious or worthy of honest examination. If anything, it reinforces just how directly and predictably this kind of systematic sexual exploitation tends to emerge whenever a society builds slavery into its fundamental legal and economic structure, regardless of that same society's other cultural or intellectual accomplishments. Let's talk about why studying this specific history honestly actually matters for understanding the present too, because it's worth closing this discussion with a direct acknowledgement of why this kind of difficult historical examination carries genuine, ongoing relevance beyond pure historical curiosity alone. Contemporary scholars and human rights organizations studying modern human trafficking and sexual exploitation have specifically drawn on historical research into ancient institutions like the one discussed throughout this topic, identifying recurring structural patterns, the removal of legal personhood, the normalization of exploitation through surrounding social and economic systems, and the systematic silencing of victims' own direct testimony that continue appearing across different historical periods and different specific forms of exploitation, right through to certain forms of modern human trafficking and exploitation still documented today. Understanding how these patterns operated within ancient Greek society specifically offers genuine, practical insight into recognizing and addressing similar underlying structural patterns wherever they continue to appear in the present, reinforcing that this kind of honest historical examination serves a meaningful purpose extending well beyond simple historical interest alone. It's worth closing this particular discussion by returning directly to the human beings actually at the center of this history, individuals whose names, direct words, and personal experiences were largely lost to the historical record specifically because the society that enslaved them had no interest in preserving their own perspective or testimony. Honest historical scholarship on this topic works specifically to recover and center whatever can actually be responsibly reconstructed about their genuine experience, resisting the easier, more comfortable temptation to focus primarily on the philosophical and cultural achievements of the society that enslaved them instead. Let's zoom out and pull all of these different threads together, because the full historical reality of sexual slavery in ancient Greece turns out to represent a really horrifying institution precisely because of the complete systematic absence of any legal protection, personal autonomy, or meaningful consent available to the individuals trapped within it. These were real historical people, stripped of their basic legal personhood through warfare, poverty, or simply the circumstance of their birth, then subjected to sustained sexual exploitation as legal property with absolutely no recourse or protection available under ancient Greek law. This institution existed as a legally sanctioned, socially normalized feature of ancient Greek society, coexisting directly alongside the philosophical and cultural achievements that same society remains celebrated for today. A coexistence that responsible historical understanding requires acknowledging honestly rather than minimizing or overlooking. So the next time ancient Greece comes up in conversation, celebrated for its genuine, significant philosophical and cultural contributions, it's worth remembering that this same historical society also maintained institutions responsible for profound, sustained human suffering, experienced by real individuals whose own voices and direct testimony were rarely preserved within the historical record that has survived to reach us today. A complete, honest understanding of any historical society requires reckoning with this full, complicated reality, rather than selectively remembering only the achievements worth celebrating, while quietly setting aside the genuine human cost that requires equally serious, honest historical attention. Let's talk briefly about how this history continues shaping contemporary classical scholarship too, because it represents a fitting additional detail worth including before this discussion concludes. Growing numbers of contemporary classicists and ancient historians have specifically dedicated their scholarly careers toward recovering and centering the experience of enslaved individuals within ancient Greek society more broadly, representing an important, ongoing corrective shift within the broader field of classical studies. One that continues actively working to ensure this difficult history receives the serious, honest scholarly attention it deserves alongside the more traditionally celebrated aspects of ancient Greek civilization. Let's talk about one final point worth including before this discussion concludes, because it offers an appropriate way to close out this seriously difficult historical topic. The individuals actually subjected to this institution deserve to be remembered as full human beings who experienced real suffering, rather than as an abstract historical footnote existing purely to illustrate broader points about ancient Greek society or its accompanying legal and social structures. Every historical account of this institution, including this one, carries a responsibility to keep that basic human reality clearly, consistently in view throughout the entire discussion, rather than allowing the genuine scholarly and historical complexity already explored throughout this topic to obscure the simple, fundamental truth that real people suffered genuine, sustained harm within this system. Harm that deserves honest acknowledgement regardless of how many centuries have since passed. which leaves an interesting thought worth sitting with. If a society as celebrated for its intellectual and philosophical achievement as ancient Greece could simultaneously maintain and normalize an institution this truly horrifying, without that same society's own intellectual tradition treating it as any kind of serious moral contradiction requiring examination, what does that suggest about how carefully every historical society, including our own, deserves ongoing, honest scrutiny regarding which forms of serious human suffering we might currently be normalizing or overlooking simply because they exist alongside other things our own society considers worth celebrating?